Okay, the last thing we're going to do today is contextualize the course in a little bit of history and demographics. So what do I mean by that? I mean putting ourselves in time and putting ourselves in numbers of people through time. And so that's what we'll spend this will take about 10 more minutes doing today. So first of all, slide those a little bit busted. First of all, we got to start with a really, really brief introduction to the so-called prehistory of Native America. Now, we'll spend a whole class talking about Native prehistory later in the semester, so I'm not going to go crazy with this, but I am going to, in the next 3 or 4 minutes, try and cover roughly 10,000 years of history. So we're going to move really kind of fast here. So archaeologists are interested in this period we call prehistory. This is any time prior to the arrival of Europeans in this region. Probably people first come to populate North and South America sometime between 25 and 15,000 years ago. Could possibly be earlier. Some argue it's later. This is quite actually a controversial and highly, highly debated question in archaeology today. Again, way at the end of the course, really not that long, about 2.5 weeks, we'll talk about this in a lot of depth and detail, so I won't belabor it now. That's probably the earliest people that we know archaeologically being in this region. I should note that many Native cosmologies, the religious beliefs of Native people, argue that Native people have been here forever, that they were born here, that they evolved here perhaps. And so there is a conflict here between archaeological knowledge and what we might call kind of traditional Native knowledge. And whether those two things can coexist is another challenging question. Now, the broad prehistoric period that happens after that first peopling at 15 to 25,000 years ago spans the last 10,000 years. And during that period, that's a humongous amount of time. This is the same amount of time that agriculture has existed since its invention in places like Mesopotamia. This is as long as we've been around since the emergence of the complex state societies in the world. People have been in the New World for that entire period. So we're really talking about a massive span of time, and just as much societal complexity is going to evolve here in North America as did in other parts of the world. So from about 10,000 years ago to about 500 years ago, we have a great deal of complexity and variation. Again, we'll talk about this later in the semester. Right? And so in that period, we have these really broad spans of time that we call the Archaic period, which runs from about 10,000 to about 3,000 years ago, and the Woodland from about 3,000 to about 500 years ago. I only give you those terms because I'll use them from time to time, and I want you to be familiar with what they mean. Again, later in the course, we'll talk about those a lot. Sort of stuff. So, that era of prehistory ends at about 500 years ago with what we might call, very broadly, the era of quote-unquote discovery. I put that in quotes for something you're already familiar with. You know that this term discovery is problematic. You know that that Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492 is not the beginning of Native history. That Native history predates that by, as I've just said, many thousands of years. And that the arrival of Europeans is not the most important thing that ever happened to Native people. That being said, it is a very powerful moment. It is the moment at which we start to have a historical record in this region, with some rare exceptions. There are some writing in North and South America prior to the arrival of Europeans. But for the most part, this is when we have expansive historical records, and this is also the point at which we see the beginning of the colonial era. So for all these reasons, we're going to focus primarily on this last 500 or 600 years of Native history. Some of the most important documents that we have from this era emerge very early, in the 15th century, and they're called the Papal Bulls. In 1452 and 1493, you don't need to remember those dates, the Pope put out a couple of documents. When the Pope puts out a document that it decrees something, we call it a Papal Bull. The Pope still writes these today. But these two are really important. In the mid-15th century, Europeans faced an existential crisis. They had lived in relative isolation for a very long time, had a pretty firm understanding of what the world was, what the hierarchy of the world was, what God wanted from them. They lived in a very Judeo-Christian centric world, and they understood that world pretty comfortably. What Christopher Columbus and the other early explorers did do was cause a crisis of identity in Europe, because they suddenly showed that there were many more places and many more people than Europeans had previously understood. And initially, questions were raised about whether these folks were actually people at all, whether they could be Christianized, whether they had souls, whether they could be civilized. These were the fundamental questions that Europeans rose in those first years of European exploration. And so the Pope, who was the preeminent and dominant figure of the time, this is you can tell, really just right before the Protestant Reformation, and so the Catholic Church is still dominant over pretty much all of Europe. The Pope is asked to lay down a verdict on who these people are and what they mean for Europeans going forward. And so the Pope and the Crown sort of worked together to come up with an answer to that question that benefited them both. And so what the Pope said was, yes, all of these folks, Native Americans from North and South America, Native Australians, Africans, what these people were was human, and they had souls. They could be Christianized, they could be saved, they could go to heaven, etc., etc. But also that they were not the same as Europeans, that there was a racial hierarchy, and that these people were below Europeans on that racial hierarchy. And so as early as the mid-15th century, we are already seeing emerge the racial hegemony and hierarchy that we still are dealing with today in 2017. It's pretty incredible, actually. We're a half millennium on from this idea. And it starts with this early colonial era. And this deal was struck because the Pope was interested in gathering converts. He wanted new Christians. And the monarchs wanted resources and land. And so they hoped that they could get both those things out of this system that said, yes, these are humans, they can be converted to Christianity, but no, they are not the same as us, and it's okay to dominate them. Now, all of that was important and drives the emergence of widespread enslavement of Africans, genocide in North and South America and Australia, the taking of massive amounts of resources and land from Native people all over the world. All kinds of horrible shit emerges from that. But we had a moment when maybe the ship could have been righted on that, and it wasn't. And that moment was the transition to federalism. So in 1776, a little upstart country called the United States overthrows its English monarch and becomes an independent nation. We know that story. We're pretty familiar with that. And that new nation now had to deal with what it was going to do with its legacy of colonialism. What was it going to do with the fact that the lands on which that nation sat were traditionally native lands, that those lands had been taken, most likely unjustly, by Native Americans in almost all cases. What was going to be done with the fact that Native people were living on reservations? In some cases, Native people were still being enslaved. What was and being killed in horrible ways in certain places, and open warfare with some Native groups. What was going to be done about all of that? So basically, the early Supreme Court, the first Supreme Courts of the United States, reaffirmed what was called the doctrine of discovery. So what they said was that what the Pope's papal bulls in the 15th century said was that Europeans had the power to discover places that already had people living in them. They could discover those places, they could take them by right of conquest, they could take them from Native people and from African people and from North Americans and South Americans and Australians. And that those things would become theirs. That idea was known as the doctrine of discovery. The early Supreme Court reaffirms that idea of the doctrine of discovery. It basically says that the gains that were, that's the actual word from the text, the gains that were taken by European nations before the adoption of federalism transferred to the new nation. And so they codified the doctrine of discovery into American law. The Constitution itself lays out a system of what's called domestic dependency for tribal nations. So the Supreme Court and the early Constitution are going to say that it is the role of the U.S. government to take care of, to put on reservations, to protect and carefully cultivate native people away from other people, to segregate them onto their own lands and protect them. And so that notion comes to be known as domestic dependency. So we have three terms here that I want you to be familiar with. First is the doctrine of discovery. The second is domestic dependency. And the third is manifest destiny. Building on doctrine of discovery and the domestic dependency rule is the notion of manifest destiny. Now, you may have learned about manifest destiny in middle school or high school. I certainly did. It is the concept that Americans had a right to move westward and conquer all of North America. That idea was based upon the notion that those lands were rightfully white Americans, not Native Americans, who were already living there and had been living there for thousands of years. So without domestic dependency, without doctrine of discovery, we don't have manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is what's going to lead to the philosophy of manifest destiny is going to lead to some of the legal structures that make that actually happen. The first is the era of relocation and reservation. Manifest destiny drives the widespread removal of native people from their traditional lands to other less desirable lands elsewhere in the country. We've all heard of the Trail of Tears. That idea happened all over the place, all over North America. Reservations are places where Indian people are separated from the broader public in order to protect them. Again, going back to this notion of domestic dependency. They tend to be on lands that are extremely marginal and are not wanted by white people. And when they become wanted by white people later because some resources on them, like say coal or oil or plutonium, suddenly they become fair game again. So the only reason these lands are set aside for native people is because no one else wants them. Those are called reservations. That era effectively ends in 1871 when Congress passes a law that disallows the president's power to enter into treaties with native people, which is a power that was laid out in the Constitution. But Congress created a new law to make that not possible anymore. And that laid the framework for the 1887 General Allotment Act, at which time, now I'm moving through this very quickly, but of course we can always go back and rewatch the video or take a look at the slides that are online. In 1887, a law was passed that was perhaps one of the most detrimental to Native people, and it's called the General Allotment Act. What it did was it took reservations which had been founded for hundreds of years, some of them millions of acres in size. It broke them up into plots, gave Native people a tiny fraction of those reservation lands that had been promised to them in treaties, and gave the rest away to white settlers as they moved westward. So you've heard of the great land deals or the land runs of the late 19th century. Those were lands that were being taken away from Native people that were rightfully given to them in their treaties and were being given away to whites. And so we see that happening as early as the 1880s and 1890s. And it's going to continue on from there. So there's a couple other facts about the allotment period in the late 19th and early 20th century. Native people lost, in some cases, as much as 90% of their reservation lands, and really the system of crushing poverty we see on a lot of Native reservations begins in this period. So that's what I've got for this kind of framing of the course. So we're leaving off here in about the 1880s and 90s, which is just right, because what I want you to do tomorrow is watch the film Real Injun, which I'll put a link to on Blackboard. You can watch it through the library's website. And it's a documentary. It's a really cool documentary. I'll talk about it a little bit before. I'll maybe put a short video intro to it before you watch it. I want you to watch the film, and that's going to really start in the 1890s, and it's going to talk about the way in which Native people have been envisioned through the media of film primarily since that time period. So take a look at the assignments I've got for you located after this video.